Hey Scott, brilliant to meet you again.
Nice to see you, Fabian. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Let's start with a quick introduction, if that's okay. Let's learn a little bit more about your professional journey.
Yeah, sure. So, Scott Newton, I grew up in Canada. I'm based in Northeast Italy. I've been working in the strategy and mobility space for the past, well, I don't want to say how many decades, but it's many decades. And I also have a base in executive education where I teach strategy and digital transformation, as well as fund management.
Fascinating. Technology has fundamentally transformed many businesses across the globe. Many have said you probably heard this quote that no business isn't a digital business anymore, or every business is a digital business. How has the rise of technology over the past 10 years changed how organizations make strategy?
That's a great question. It's a big question. Um, Look, I think that the biggest change I've seen in business is disruption of business models and a shift from looking at what was kind of the traditional supply chain approach of organizations to ecosystems. And that's kind of a nerdy word. I know when I bring up ecosystems with boards and management teams, some people roll their eyes. But I have found it's really interesting. If I put the word digital in front of it, all of a sudden it's super cool. So if I say digital ecosystems, people get really excited. But what these changes mean is that the traditional way that we have created value and made money are shifting, and new entrants that were not even in existence 10 years ago are now dominating the market, and legacy players are struggling to keep up and may not even remain relevant. And so I think it's this speed of change, and what cloud computing especially has allowed is removed a big barrier to entry. So one of the biggest barriers to entry used to be that the capital required to harness one of these big computing systems could be hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars or pounds. And so new entries really couldn't come into the market because they just didn't have access to that much capital, or it was considered too risky. Now, what we can see with this accessibility of cloud and 5G being practically everywhere is that anyone can be a competitor. I'll give you, an interesting example. My electrician is 94 years old, and he's quite an interesting guy. He has a huge passion for fixing things that are broken, old electrical things, turntables from the 1960s. Some people would say this is junk, but he loves it, and he does this. Well, he started doing business on eBay. And this guy is so busy. And he was showing me the other day. He said, "Look at this. I have customers in Brazil, and I have a customer in Cairo, and I have a customer in Shanghai." This is a 94-year-old electrician who is working purely for the joy of working, but he's located in a small mountain town in Italy in a business he's been running since the 1940s, and he's got clients all over the world. That would be unthinkable even 10 years ago. So the world is really changing, and I find it very exciting, but I also find it also threatening in the sense of if we don't keep moving, our risk is we become irrelevant.
No, thank you so much for the context. You've done a lot of work in the automotive and mobility space over your career. Linking this to this argument related to digital ecosystems, what many manufacturers, whether new entrants or incumbents, seem to struggle with in some respect is really clearly articulating what makes them unique and different and how they establish a competitive advantage in the market. Linking this to this digital partner network ecosystem, how can organizations actually be different if most of the factors that would make their products and services and brands different are digital components and are heavily reliant on their ecosystem?
It's a good question. I think one that every automotive management team and board are struggling with at the moment. We see new brands entering the market every day. I was in a shopping center here near Milan, Italy, yesterday, and there were three new brands of automotive with pretty good looking SUVs, and I've never heard of any of the three of them. And I mean, this is just coming at such a speed. And so the question is, what can the car companies or the brands do to differentiate and to keep that passion. So it used to be, at least as I've been growing up, that a BMW driver would never become a Mercedes driver. To give a couple of, I mean, it just was two different worlds, and there are a lot of jokes that are quite colorful about the different types of people, etc. So the brands had a real unique image and were part of customer passion. And of course, when we look at younger customers today, they don't have this same affiliation. They're much more interested in how their electronics integrate with the vehicle and how the experience can be tied into their social media platforms, etc. So, what does this mean for automotive? I think the brands that are going to win are the ones that can quickly bring new innovation to the market and can do it at price points that make sense. So many of the electric vehicles, for example, I see today are essentially taking the gas motor powered vehicle, changing it to a big array of batteries, and bumping up the price by putting a lot of options in. And so you see these vehicles 200,000 euros, 300,000 euros. And that does appeal to a small niche market. And it's a way that manufacturers can test some innovation, et cetera. But the mass market of vehicles, what people are really looking for are, their daily drivers. And so what can organizations do to have this innovation and affordability? And I think it really starts with supply chain. And so there needs to be a reworking of the entire logic of the tier one, tier two, external supplier networks, and much more collaboration than there is today, and speed. So I'm looking, the benchmark today is BYD in Shenzhen. They can get a vehicle from concept to production in 14 months. Their competitors in Munich or Stuttgart or Torino take 48 to 60 months. So this time compression is going to be necessary, particularly as customer expectations continue to change and the phone becomes more important than the actual vehicle. So I hear young people asking a lot about, does it integrate with CarPlay? For them, that's a much more important function than, I was young. The first question would always be, how many horsepower does it have? Which it's a concept doesn't even exist anymore. But it was really important when I was young, or 0 to 60 times, which are practically irrelevant in the electrification world.
Don't make me feel old. I was still talking about the horsepowers with my friends for my first car. Do you know why BYD is so much quicker to market? You mentioned 14 months there versus the sort of traditional 3 to 4 years is what we hear a lot.
Yeah, I think there are a few factors that all come together for BYD. The first is, the organization of the supply chain in China just moves at a different speed to start with. And so if I look at what's happened in Detroit or in Germany or Italy and France, over the post World War II period, these very complex integrated supply chains have been built up where the roles are connected. So for every role in a tier one, there's a corresponding role in a tier two. And those two roles then interface with different people inside the manufacturing of the brand that are all siloed. So there's a quality silo, there's an engineering silo, there's a purchasing silo. And these departments are all in some ways competing with each other. And what BYD did, because they started from zero, they didn't create this structure. So they have everything integrated. And that integration means you've broken down all those silos. That's part one. The second part to this that I find so important is the way they approach vehicle design. So the Japanese have just published in Asia Nikkei Daily a study. They bought all these Chinese cars, took them to Japan, and tore them apart, which is very common in the automotive industry, reverse engineering or whatever you want to politely call it. What they found, though, and what shocked them is that the BYD cars had 2/3 less parts, components, than a competing Japanese vehicle. And so, Toyota, who I have great respect for, have taken the combustion engine and pretty much made it as close to indestructible as possible, but it has thousands and thousands of moving pieces. And what the Chinese have done, because they're not starting with this legacy debt, is they've said, okay, we don't need all those pieces. And so, of course, when you have 2/3 less components, I mean, design time becomes so much faster. And so I think that's another differentiator. And we need to really rethink from zero what is mobility and what does a customer need in terms of go to market. And I'm not sure that those jobs to be done, as we talk a lot about in go to market, are actually very well defined yet.
Linking the jobs to be done theory, which I believe Clayton Christian in many years
Yeah,
introduced, to another theory, which is called dynamic capabilities. David Tees
right.
and some of his peers introduces, which is in some ways tautological and essentially just says something along the lines of the better you are at adapting to your dynamically changing environment, the better you will do over the long term as a
Right.
business. And you kind of alluded to this here as well. But one of the challenges or criticisms this theory receives is that it's not very practical for managers to implement. What um, what we have observed, I guess, over the past couple of years, the adoption of new management frameworks like objectives and key results that promise an improved element of adaptability in terms of organizational priorities to an ever-changing environment. And I mean, if we look at our 5-year plan 5 years ago, I'm pretty sure Gen AI, OpenAI, ChatGPT, all of these things aren't on there, and probably also not the disruption that we currently see in the automotive and mobility context. Which leads me to the question. I know this was a sort of long context to that. Is how what is your view on management frameworks in terms of setting the right priorities and reflecting this in your internal incentive structures that could actually work in an automotive context?
It's a great question. There are many questions in there. Let me see, though, if I can give a succinct answer. Okay, so first of all, I've found that there is this trend of wanting to take concepts that work very well in the software industry, like OKRs, and port them over into the industrial production industries. And I can understand that because there is a desire to do things more quickly and to accelerate change. I don't think necessarily that what is applicable in software development for organizations in California necessarily works for hardware and industrial industries in Europe or Asia, etc. But what I do think that we can take from all the various frameworks, and what I like to use when I'm working with boards and management teams, is this idea of external and internal. And so in most organizations, I find we're very internal looking. And so we think about how we can improve our processes, but it's from our internal perspective. And we think about how we can reduce mistakes, but it's from our internal perspective. And we don't go externally and say, how is the environment changing and what will that mean for customer preferences and demands and desires of tomorrow? And so automotive is something, of course, it's been a big part of our identity. And so ever since, particularly post Second World War, if you look at music, media, culture, a lot of it centers around the automobile. And so, what brand of car you have is very important, or what color car you choose to drive, etc., is something that is links to your masculinity or femininity, etc. And now, though, this is changing. And so, as this changes, and I'm bringing it back to the question of frameworks, we have to ask about what is most important for our customers and how is technology changing their preferences. I think the biggest change is still yet to come. And that's when the autonomous vehicle becomes mainstream, which I believe is less than 10 years away now. I think it could be even faster. I mean, there are already taxis without drivers in California, Arizona. They're testing them in Atlanta. And then, of course, China is a whole nother world, years and years ahead. But it will take a while for regulation to catch up, etc. The point is, once the autonomous vehicle becomes mainstream, my requirement to own an automobile decreases significantly. And with that decrease, the implication is that I'm really not as interested in the brand. I mean, when I call up an Uber, I don't check to see what brand of car it is or say like, "Oh no, I'm not going to ride in a Toyota. No, I'll decline that driver and look for, a Porsche or something." I don't really care that much as long as it's safe and somewhat clean and can get me where I'm going. So how will the mobility companies of tomorrow stand out, and how will they compete? And there will always be the niches. So, I mean, I have a colleague who's very passionate about motorsport, and they race Porsches on the weekend. And I cannot imagine they will ever shift from a combustion engine Porsche. It's part of their passion. But this is the niche. This is the 1%, the 2% of people. So for the majority of people, this is no longer going to be a driving force. And so, coming back to how do you take decisions, you need to look at those external trends and continue to test them to see are your assumptions valid and what are the implications. And this is where I see this outside in thinking becoming more and more important than ever before, and considering not just how technology will change, but all the other forces put together will shift markets far more quickly than what we've seen in the last 50 years.
Building on it, if it's not horsepower, if it's not brand, what what is left in terms of a possible differentiator amongst brands?
Yeah. Well, and again, I don't know that all markets will be the same. What we can see already in Asia Pacific is this integration of electronics. So the better the phone can become part of the car, or gaming can be part of the vehicle, the more the customer is interested in choosing or buying that vehicle. So we have this integration of electronics, which frankly has proven to be very tough. I mean, with the exception of Apple CarPlay, I've seen very few examples of where the electronics integrate intuitively into the vehicle. And I mean, we can see the GPS systems, which are in almost every vehicle sold today. Most people don't ever even use them. They use Google Maps. So, I mean, I'm driving a brand new BMW. I never turned on the navigation system of the car because I'm just so used to Google Maps, and everything I have is programmed into Google Maps. And I wouldn't have chosen this car had it not had that Google Map integration via Apple. I just wouldn't. It's too inconvenient for me. And even when I rent cars quite frequently in the United States, for example. I will request a vehicle with CarPlay, and if it doesn't have it, I'll change cars because I don't want to learn something new, which is maybe my old. So electronic integration is one thing, and there are still many dimensions on performance. Reliability is a big issue. Some of the newer players that have entered into the Italian market, for example, where I live, are struggling with service and spare parts. And so these factors will continue to be important. And I think that reliability and speed of repair will still remain relevant into the future as long as we have vehicles. Because even if I'm a fleet buyer, they're going to look very closely at what's the reliability, the uptime of this vehicle.
You do and have been doing for many years work across the globe, across China, the US, Europe, and the Middle East, and so on. And currently, there are many debates happening in the automotive industry in terms of how some of these dynamics play out in terms of new entrants, investments in SEA, in Lucid, in the Middle East,
Mhm.
what's happening in Central Europe with companies like Volkswagen that are downsizing, in the US with some of these established brands that seem to struggle with the adoption of some of these new technologies. But especially China seems to be a market that's currently really interesting with you alluded to some of these quicker time to markets, which arguably gives some of these manufacturers and brands a competitive edge in terms of pushing some of these new technologies faster in the market, which on the flip side also allows them to potentially gain a first move advantage in some respects in an environmental context, as you said, where customers with the transition from ICE to EV are much more willing to switch brands. Some might not even care anymore. How do you think realistically over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, Of course, a very speculative question, but some of these new entrants play out in terms of actually being able to capture market share from these incumbents, given that it's a saturated market. So if one wins, someone else arguably loses the market share.
Yeah, it's going to be a brutal fight. And look, I mean, I've seen this with other technologies in China, and I think we're seeing it now again with mobility. What China tends to do is fund everyone to get into the market. So at the last count I saw, there are 239 brands of cars in the domestic Chinese market, if you can imagine. 239. Out of those 239, probably maximum three will survive long term. And so it's, a question of who are going to be those winners. There are some names that we hear quite frequently. So people like to talk a lot about BYD, partly because it was back to early stage by Warren Buffett, which is distinct. But there are also Xiaomi, which is doing very well in the market. NIO says that they can assemble cars with practically no people. So it's all robots. Leap Motor has a JV with Stellantis, and I think they're about to start making vehicles in Slovakia, if I understand correctly. But in all these cases, it's going to come down to most of these players will go away in a few years, and we'll be left with two, three, no more than three national champions coming out of the China market. Probably quite similar to what Sergio Marchionne predicted when he was leading Stellantis. In Europe, there will remain maximum two big players. Um, who are going to be the two? We don't know, but there just won't be space in the market for more. And the United States is a bit different in that the United States right now is a very protected market, and politically will probably remain that way for at least the next 5 years. With this, they could be isolated, but of course the challenge is, can you really afford to develop and build a car platform if it's servicing just one economy? And I think the answer is no long term. So the US risks to fall very far behind in the mobility space and may not end up being a player at all. But in Europe, we'll see two. China, we'll see three. Japan, we'll see one. Um, and that's probably it. And mobility will become sort of like the mobile telephone. If you remember, again, I started way back when there was that Motorola, the big brick, and then there came to the market hundreds of different suppliers of mobile phones, and it seemed like everybody was selling a mobile phone at one point. And yet today we're really left with two choices, right? Are you Android or are you Apple? And there are some very small niche players on the edges, but it's really Android or Apple. And I think we'll see the same kind of discussion with automotive, and it'll be like the Studebaker Museum in South Bend, Indiana. I mean, I love that museum; it's beautiful, but there's no more Studebaker. Unfortunately, I think that's what's going to happen.
Linking some of these points we've discussed so far, and to the topic of business model innovation.
Mm.
Automotive OEMs historically have arguably been supply chain orchestrators as sort of their core bread and butter business, and in many respects they're still. However, you alluded to that the differentiators are no longer in sort of traditional quality metrics necessarily, are no longer sort of horsepower, engine sizes, and sort of necessarily driving characteristics, but we see the rise of mobility services, of autonomous driving, of connectivity features, and in an environment where digital ecosystems are competing more and more. What does this imply for automotive OEMs in terms of how their business model is or needs to adapt?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that we have to go back to the drawing board, and so the idea that people are going to, save up money and buy a car or go into debt to purchase a vehicle will become a niche concept that very few people adopt, and most people will move to a pay-per-use model of their vehicle. And so for a service provider, they're going to have to completely rethink their logic because they will not make their money on selling the vehicle, so to speak. They will make it on ancillary services. So that could be media, that could be advertising, that could be training. We're going to have all this extra time when we're inside a transportation system, but we're not needing to operate it. And so, what do we do with that time? And there are many creative suggestions, some legal, some not legal, of how that time could be used. But look, that is, someone is going to master this. And as they do so, there will be new ways that organizations can become profitable throughout the ecosystem. And I think back to another example, it's not in mobility, but I think it gives us a glimpse of the future. So there's this huge problem in China that all the buildings that were built post 1970 didn't have elevators in them. And when people only lived till they were 70 years old, that was fine. But now people, of course, are living much longer and they have reduced mobility as they get older. And so these buildings need to be retrofitted with elevators for older people. But people inside the buildings cannot afford to pay to buy an elevator, which is very expensive. So what are companies doing? Well, they're installing elevators and you pay per use. So the GPS on your phone knows when you go inside the elevator, and every time you do, you pay the equivalent of 10 RMB, so about what is that, 7 euro cents per ride, and it's automatically deducted from your bank account. And there's enough people doing this that actually the company that sold the elevator is making more profit than they would have in the traditional model of sell an elevator. So we're going to see the same kind of thing in mobility. Now the question is how to monetize these services and how to explain to investors your new business models and how they actually work. And so far, I don't think anybody's cracked this code, but someone is about to crack it.
Let's briefly touch on Gen AI in the automotive and mobility context.
Right.
How do you see Gen AI disrupting the industry in terms of unlocking further efficiency and effectiveness, or potentially transforming how users engage with brands, products, and services?
Yeah, let's start from the easiest place, which is the forecourt of the dealer. And so one of the greatest inefficiencies right now is that you've got these thousands, hundreds of thousands of dealers, and they all have inventory trapped in their local market, so to speak. And often that inventory is in the wrong place. So, CarMax, which is one of the biggest used car resellers in the United States, actually has a partnership now with Microsoft where they're optimizing inventory positioning using Gen AI based on where demand will be. So you can actually model demand much more accurately than what a human can do, and have the right vehicles in the right places at the right price at the right time. So you need significantly less inventory to have the same volume of sales. So this is one very simple example of Gen AI. If we go all the way back to the drawing board, Toyota is already using Gen AI to look at design capabilities. So what could a next generation vehicle look like? And where we started in the discussion earlier, this idea that we take a traditional car and pull out the motor and put in some batteries. Why do cars need to look the way they do? I mean, the car design has all been built around the needs and the safety of the ICE platform. And when we no longer have that ICE platform, we can go in a completely different direction in design. And so I think we'll see vehicles that look so different than what we have today. At the same time, injection molding technologies have progressed tremendously. Glazing technologies where we can replace glass with plastic. In the last 20 years, it's been such a breakthrough, and this breakthrough continues at rocket speed. So Gen AI can help designers think of a completely different way of vehicles. And then one other area where already we're seeing big breakthrough improvements is predictive maintenance. So rather than waiting for your tire to explode or your engine to fail, the car can predict when something will go wrong and actually have preventative maintenance rather than that very expensive failure type of maintenance, which we don't want.
First of all, thank you so much. Really, really interesting overview of the possible use cases and value value pools. Building on it, Imagine that you're talking to a chief data and AI officer who is in charge of managing these initiatives and the associated organization-wide strategy for data and AI. What would be your top three recommendations to him or her to unlock this value in a sustainable way?
Yeah, it all starts with building a data culture. And that sounds easy to say and is actually very challenging in most organizations. So we're not viewing data yet as a key asset that everyone can unlock value with. And this is where we need to shift the mentality of every employee, every supplier, every customer, and build this data culture. Uh, when that happens, so many opportunities become apparent. The second thing we need to look at is viewing the ecosystem, not the supply chain. So, shifting that mentality towards ecosystems and understanding where the value is. And we can see in appliances, for example, how Hire has unlocked this tremendous value. Uh, they bought GE Appliances, which is the biggest seller of appliances in America, and it had been losing money for several years and was considered quite poor for quality. Their go to market was having lowest price, and customers who bought it were not expecting much other than it was cheap. When Hire bought this and shifted to an ecosystem play and thinking in terms of ecosystems and eliminating this supply chain bureaucracy, GE became a top performing brand in the American market. It's now profitable and is now considered very innovative. So this all happened by shifting the mindset and thinking in terms of customers and innovation as opposed to supply chain and bureaucracy. So that's the second thing that I think every Gen AI person needs to be looking at. And then the third is that, in my opinion, AI should not be a function in organizations. AI should be part of every single person's job. So there is this tendency at the moment to have a chief AI officer in every organization. Long term, I do not think that role will remain. It will be everybody's job. Just as we don't have a chief market share officer inside companies, because market share is a result of everybody's activity, we're going to see that technology is embraced by every employee. And we don't have a department that is working on this. It's just part of our job. And we come to work in the morning and say, how could technology make this easier? Or what are my customer unmet needs? I look at an example. Today, my bank called me early this morning, and they said, we need to update your KYC. And I don't know if you've ever gone through this procedure, the know your customer, which is a legal requirement. But I closed my eyes and I said, this is going to be extremely painful because normally you submit all these documents and they're the wrong documents. And then someone loses a document. And this goes back and forth from wherever your bank is, back and forth, back and forth. It's painful. It takes a lot of time. It's never right. And they said, no, we've got it all in an app now. And you can do it on your mobile phone. And I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. I did my KYC in 30 seconds. And 30 seconds later, I received an email saying, your KYC has been approved. It's now in place till 2033. I mean, just think about what's happened there. What used to take me personally 4 to 5 hours, my accounting office 8 to 10 hours, plus all these mistakes and couriers and back and forth, is now done on an app in less than 30 seconds and with higher accuracy. Now, how can we take that type of innovation and move it into mobility? And think about, I've seen, I mean, recently, I saw a new supplier contract from one of the brands. It was 1,400 pages, right? So someone wrote 1,400 pages, and now this supplier's lawyer is going to need to read 1,400 pages. And then for sure there will be a dispute about something, and this will go back and forth. And in an optimistic world, this will take 120 days. So that new car is not being developed for 4 months because somebody in a legal office thought a 1,400 page contract would be better. So, you know, we're, we're killing ourselves with bureaucracy. And we need to look at where do we unlock this value and where do we make things easier and faster for everyone in our ecosystem. If there can be a 30-second KYC for a bank, why can't there be a 30-second approval process for a supplier in automotive?
Thank you so much, Scott. It's been a fascinating, super insightful conversation. Really appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks, Fabian. I really appreciate the discussion, and I hope your listeners find it interesting and insightful. And if they think I'm wrong, they can tell me you're wrong. I'm happy to hear that. I'm always learning.